Hi folks, I'm Squirrelmob. For those of you who don't know me or haven't heard of me, I'm not surprised. I'm not really a big person, not really a big name. I'm just a guy who enjoys playing Magic. I've played Magic for close to 20 years now. I've played EDH for a solid 13 of them, right? I've been playing since 2007. And what this video is about today is just my opinion on something that's been a constant all the time that I've played EDH, which is this idea that the rules committee doesn't know what they're doing. When I hear people say that, or various variations on that, things like, they don't understand Magic, they don't understand competitive Magic, they just ban things they lose to. All of those stick in my head, not as bad faith arguments, although certainly some of them are, but they stick in my head as people pointing out something that decisions don't make sense to that particular person. And I've been around a while, which is why most of the decisions the RC makes do kind of make sense to me, but most people haven't been around a while. And there's a lot of things that have happened in the history of Commander that make sense, or make more sense of what the RC decides to do in the present time if you know about them. And so this is just a little video to kind of tie the institutional memory of the RC, which I'm not claiming I am the institutional memory of the RC. I wasn't around for all the stuff I'm going to talk about. This is just some basics. But these are things that help kind of contextualize the way the RC approaches things. So, sit back, take a listen, and hopefully you'll either learn something, enjoy, or feel fired up enough about it to leave some comments so that you help the algorithm. Have fun with it. Now, before we dive into this, I'm just going to apologize. I don't have any tech skills, so what you're seeing is a screencast. It's not particularly edited. It's just rolling with what we got. So let's dive in. First thing that we think about when we talk about any decision the RC makes, we think about the format philosophy. And that's because that's what they always point us to, right? It fits with the philosophy in this way, this way, this way, whatever. The philosophy has a few highlights. We're just going to quickly pull them up. These aren't my things that I've pulled from the philosophy as highlights. These are the things that are bolded. If you go into the philosophy and read it, there's a number of statements that are in bold. And these are what they say. Commander is for fun. It creates a resonant experience with a social contract. The rules emphasize the format's flavor. The ban list doesn't try to regulate competitive play, and it focuses on cards which are problematic because of consistency, ubiquity, the ability to restrict the opportunities of others. They like to be conservative with the ban list. The ban list is a baseline. You can mess around with it with your group and change it for your own needs, which means that players are just encouraged to discuss what they want in a game. And kind of the kicker to it all is the last line is the format can be broken, and the RC believes the games are more fun if you don't break it. Now, this already is defined by the RC's experience, right? This is defined by historically where Commander came from. It came out of the desire to have a refuge for competitive play, a refuge for casual players who didn't want to engage in a competitive way, in a competitive nature. Now we'll get into what that means a little bit more, but already the philosophy itself is shaped by the experiences of the members of the RC. And those experiences, they don't always do a good job explaining to the general player base. Those experiences also are what shape the ban list criteria. Now, to be fair, they straight up tell us this isn't a checklist, it's not comprehensive, there's other things that could be added to it, but these are the basic ideas. Cards that cause severe resource imbalances, that allow players to win out of nowhere, that prevent players from contributing to the game, that cause other players to feel like they have to play certain things, that are very difficult to interact with, that interact poorly with the multiplayer rules or the rules of Commander, and that lead to competitive or repetitive gameplay. These are all the things that they look at when they look at banning things or unbanning them. But there are lots of cards that fit many of these criteria that aren't banned, right? And people talk about them all the time. You hear about Expropriate, or Cyclonic Rift, or Armageddon, or Winter Orb, or Static Orb, or insert whatever card people are complaining about today, right? Almost every card in Magic you can probably point somewhere on this list might have a problem. Maybe not almost every card, but a lot of them, right? Because the best cards in Magic oftentimes do some of these things. And that's okay, right? Not every card needs to be banned. Remember, one of their philosophies is be conservative with the ban list. That means keep it small, keep it narrow. One, because it's easier for players to grapple with, and two, because it's an attractive thing for the format. Not having to go through and figure out which 200 cards are banned, that makes everything easier for everybody. Now, where do these ideas come from? That's what I want to get at in this. Because when we can start to see the why behind the what, it helps make things make more sense. And in this case, the what isn't ban decisions. The why behind that what is the philosophy. I want to get behind the philosophy. What's the why to the what of the philosophy? And that's where the history of the format comes into play. Now I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I don't know everything about the history of the format. It was played before I was even that interested in Magic. I was playing it already, but I wasn't invested yet. And the original source is from when I was 7 years old, right? The first thing that EDH came out of was an article in 1996. But there are kind of four eras in the way that I see it that define how EDH came together, how Commander came to be. One of my sources for this is a old MTG Salvation forum, which two members of the RC themselves actually chimed in on to kind of give their support to. So we'll have to assume that it's fairly accurate, although many of the original sources that it quotes from no longer exist. And I couldn't find them using the Wayback Machine. I'm sure that they're out there, and that's probably just user error on my end. But that's where one of the sources is. The second source are just ban list announcements, which are kept in a thread on MTG Nexus. Because many of the old announcement posts were lost to time when the Commander website changed. So using these resources and kind of using a general flow of how things have happened, in my estimation, there are four eras for Commander's history. And the first is everything from 2007 beforehand. First, there was a 1996 article in, I want to say it was Duelist magazine. I think it was called Elder Dragon Legend Wars, where each person played one of the 5 Legends Elder Dragons. You know, Nicol Bolas, Palladium Wars, Arcades Sabbath, Chromium, and Vivictus Asmati. Most of these dragons are not particularly good, but they're flavorful. And that was kind of the point. And this gets introduced to the wider world by a group in Alaska. And the group in Alaska doesn't interact with the wider world. It's Sheldon Menery, you know, the face of the Rules Committee, who takes it beyond that group in Alaska that he was familiar with. I want to say he was stationed there when he was in the military. I could be wrong about that. I don't know for sure. That's my assumption. But he takes that to events where he's judging. High-level judge, knows a lot of people, gets other judges involved in it because it's a break. It's a break for them from dealing with competitive gameplay all day long, right? So you've got players who are, or not players, you got judges watching players playing these high-level games, and then they're cutting loose after hours playing Elder Dragon Highlander. Back then, though, how the rules were put together and how the rules were tracked wasn't as simple as it is today. Today, if you want to find the rules to Commander, you can go to Wizards website and get to the Commander website. You can go to the Commander website directly. It's easy to find those rules. They might even be in inserts in some of the booster product from Commander Legends, or inserts into Commander Precons. Like, there's a lot of ways it's shared nowadays. Back then, wasn't the case. There were a couple of websites, but not necessarily a one-stop shop. The first Rules Committee website was created around 2006, I believe, which is when we start to see kind of a consolidation. And that's kind of why this era ends in 2007-ish. The creation of this rules committee and this website to house these rules and the creation of these rules at that point in time was a local affair. And it became a global affair, but even though it was global through judges, that was still very much a kind of localized play group, if you think about it. Even though they're in different locations across the globe. I know it sounds weird to call it localized, but it's a small group of individuals playing together. Just like on a Discord server nowadays. It's like a LGS, except spread across, thousands of miles. It's kind of cool, but it's still a small group of people. And that sets the tone for how the RC has handled itself and communicated for a very long time. It started small, and in many ways it still functions almost kind of like a mom and pop shop. That there's, a way they do things, and even as things around it has changed, they're still going to do things their way, for better or for worse. There's positives and negatives to it. Now back then, there were a few different rules, right? Commander in this era, we would recognize it as Commander, but the rules were pretty different. And that led to some different things happening. So, for example, Commander damage was any damage a general dealt. There was specific errata on cards. For example, Caracas was legal but couldn't bounce commanders. And I believe at one point you had to actually register what commander you were playing. So you got one commander to play and anybody else couldn't play it. And that's how small a group we're talking about here. It was small enough that people played with just one commander, which is crazy, right? Now, another thing I want to point out is how it wraps into Magic history as a whole. And during this time period, there were 42 booster sets. So 42 sets available in boosters that weren't reprint sets and that featured legendary cards in them. So from Legends forward. During this time period, 42 sets, an average of 7.57 legendary creatures per set. So there were a lot of options for legendary creatures during this time period, but it wasn't overwhelmingly so. So let's take a look at some of the cards that were banned. And these are ones that were banned and aren't anymore. Because I think that's a more interesting thing to start with, to look at, alright, why did these come off the ban list? And we start with the Judgment Era Wishes and Ring of Maroof. These are cards that grab cards from outside the game. Why were they banned? Well, the RC didn't want to go beyond the deck building restrictions that were in place. Even back then, decks were 100 cards. You had 99 plus your general. Back then, your general started in exile, which meant that it could have been grabbed by one of these wishes, because back then the wishes let you grab things from exile as well, or removed from the game is what they called it back then. At a certain point, they changed that. Exile became the exile zone. It was no longer considered outside the game. That's a whole other thing. But these were originally just flat banned. And at some point, they added the rule, which used to be called Rule 11, and now it's Rule 10. But they added the rule that said cards that can grab other cards from outside the game don't work. So now they're all legal. They just don't do anything. Which is interesting, because rather than the initial point of them being banned, which was kind of avoiding specific errata, now, even though it's not technically errata on the cards, the format rule that says they don't work functions somewhat similarly. And that makes it so that they're legal, but they don't do anything. And it's kind of a reverse of how they handled errata with other cards for this format specifically. Two other cards that were banned during this time period that kind of help explain where EDH started from were Test of Endurance and Beacon of Immortality. Test of Endurance was an alternate win con. You have enough life. At the beginning of your upkeep, you just win the game. Not terribly exciting, but nowadays, you don't really see it very much. One, because it's not exciting, but two, because it's not that good. Beacon of Immortality doubles a player's life total, and then it shuffles back into your library. Back then, the rules were still in flux regarding how much life you started with. It used to be the number of players divided, or 200 divided by the number of players. So if you had a 5-player game, it was 40 life. That's where the 40 life total comes from that we use today. But at some point, if you had a 4-player game, it would be 50 life. If you had a 3-player game, everybody started with 66 life. And in cases like that, Beacon of Immortality would create game states where everything just would become kind of this massive slog. A couple other cards that were banned during this time period, they were banned as commanders, was Heartless Hidetsugu and Niv Mizzet the Firemind. This goes to that other rules piece where it was 21 damage from a general just at all would be lethal commander damage. Now it's specifically combat damage, which means these don't have to be banned. And then there was Crucible of Worlds. Crucible of Worlds was banned largely, I believe, because it interacted with some other cards that were unbanned pretty poorly and led to game states that were just long, grindy value fests. Now here's the thing that's interesting about that, right? We see some cards here that are banned because they led to that kind of grind out value situation. Beacon of Immortality, Crucible of Worlds kind of were banned for that reason. Yet today, games where there's some grind, some value being built up, some big splashy plays, that's oftentimes cited as kind of the platonic ideal for the format. So we see a shift from when it was... Sorry, I got distracted by a phone call there. As I was saying, you had these situations where a long, drawn-out, grindy game was a problem back when the group was small enough and when Magic was early enough in its history, although it's weird to say early enough in its history because at that point it was at least 10 years old. And yet, nowadays, another 10, 15 years down the line, that sort of gameplay that had led to these cards being banned at one point in time are held up as sort of what people are looking for. So it's interesting to see that how Magic as a whole changing has impacted some of the decisions in the format. Now, there were cards banned back then that are still banned today. The first of these are the classic cards that were banned for perceived barrier to entry. Most of the Power 9. Black Lotus, Time Walk, Ancestral Recall, and of course the Moxes. Perceived barrier to entry just means that these cards basically would elucidate a response from people, not elucidate, that's the wrong word, would elicit a response from people that said, hey, as we're walking by this table and we see people playing these cards, we think they're playing vintage. EDH isn't vintage. Don't get me wrong, it has some things in common with vintage, but it's not vintage. Not at all. And so these cards were tied very closely to the identity of vintage. There's also a 9th card that fit this property as well. No, it's not the 9th card in the Power 9, Time Twister. It's what's sometimes called the card that's the Power 10, Library of Alexandria. Back then, it was tied more closely to the identity of vintage, and so it also was banned for this idea of perceived barrier to entry. That being said, if we look at all these cards, they would probably still be banned today. Time Walk, for instance, is absurd. Black Lotus, also problematic, right? That leads to just absurd imbalances very early in the game, potentially. The Moxes don't play well with the color identity rule at all. Ancestral Recall would be played basically in every blue deck, because why not? And Library of Alexandria leads to some kind of unintuitive and uninteractive play patterns, where sometimes it's better to just not do something to draw an extra card than to do the thing. And that's not particularly exciting either. Some other cards banned during this era that are still banned today also make sense. Balance and Upheaval are both global resets. They don't play nicely with the idea of what the RC wants EDH to be. It makes sense that they're banned. Biorhythm and Sway of the Stars, somewhat similarly, make sense because they don't play nicely with what the RC wants EDH to be. These are cards, all 4 of them, that take that idea of having an interactive game with some big plays and some back and forth swings and dump it all out on the ground. Balance and upheaval say, shoot, just get rid of it all, whatever, we're going to do it again or not at all. Sway of the Stars says, you did all this stuff, cool, it doesn't matter. Biorhythm's a little different because rather than strictly getting rid of everything that's been done, it presents itself as a win, right? And that seems a little bit weird because if you look at all the things that EDH is held up to be, right, all these big interactions with big spells, and even if you look at the ban announcement where Worldfire is unbanned, the RC says we want to promote people playing high-cost sorceries again. Biorhythm is kind of a poster child for that. So why is it banned? Because of the history. Historically, there was a point when EDH was small and it was this tight group where games were devolving into Biorhythm being the finisher that people were going for. And so if we think about, all right, kind of can win the game out of nowhere and kind of doesn't play nicely with the fact that we have 40 life because it puts you down to, 2 or 3, depending on how many creatures you have. And if it's the thing that everybody's doing in every game, it's repetitive. It fits outside the philosophy, right? The philosophy says this card doesn't belong here. But historically, it matches even better because there's a reason why it was put on the list in the first place that isn't just strictly philosophical, that's actually practical. It was causing a problem in games. Would it cause a problem in games today? Maybe, maybe not. Panoptic Mirror, similar thing. It was tested and determined it wasn't so good. Now, part of the testing there apparently was done 1v1 with Sheldon and somebody else playing a bunch of games at 100 life each, which is a different format than what we would recognize today. So we have to maybe take Panoptic Mirror with a grain of salt when we look at why is this still on the ban list? Now, does it lead to repetitive play? Yes, that's literally all it does, right? It repeats things. Even if you put different spells under it, it's repeating them. Does it necessarily have things that make it hard to interact with? Yeah, it does. So are there reasons it probably should still be banned? Yeah, there are. But it also, again, had a practical reason why. The philosophy today does not necessarily explain why things were banned back in the day. It does, however, explain why they remain banned today. And this is an important lens to look through, right? The philosophy is one lens, but what actually was going on is another lens entirely. The last card that was banned back then that's still banned is Yawgmoth's Bargain. This one's not particularly hard to pick out why it's banned. You pay a life, you draw a card. There's 40 life in the format. That's just kind of absurd, right? We all know that. So, that brings us to Era 2. Era 2 is 2007 to 2012. I call this the establishment era. It's when EDH begins to grow outside the original sandbox, right? So the sandbox is Alaska, it's the judges, but by word of mouth, it starts to spread. Sheldon first mentions it in an online article in 2004, so we start to see it be in the public conscious as early as 2004. 2006, they create their rules website, and from 2007 to 2012, we just have growth, both in terms of the player base and the maturity of the format. What I mean by the maturity of the format is by the end of this time period, EDH basically looked like it is today. So, we start to see the format picking up popularity. We see a place for people to discuss what's going on the RC's website. Those forums were lost, again, when the website changed to what it is now, which the change was good. The website is much more modern now, much more accessible. But also there was a lot of philosophy and a lot of discussion and a lot of really good ideas that were lost to time. And that's also an important thing to keep in mind. Those discussion forums were the main path by which everyday people could talk with the rules committee. And so when the rules committee says, we're open to unbanning cards, but come to us with an argument we haven't heard before, we don't know what arguments they have or haven't heard before because we don't have access to those discussions. They're lost to time. And that's something I think sometimes the rules committee forgets. They forget that they have this institutional knowledge and this institutional memory. And for everyday players, many of whom probably started within the last 3 to 5 years, that isn't going to be there for them. And so they might not know when they wander in and ask a question like, why is such and such card banned? They might not know the ifs and whys and what's behind it. And if we point to, this on the philosophy, the obvious response is, that doesn't make sense. What about this card? What about that card? And yeah, that's a little bit of a misdirection by the person asking the question, but at the same time, it's not necessarily invalid to do so. So, by the end of this era, we start to see Commander actually be Commander, because we have the first pre-constructed decks released in 2011. Now, there's a reason I put them here, and I used the 2013 ones as the dividing point for the next era. I'll get to that in a minute. Now, this represents the change from Elder Dragon Highlander being the name to Commander being the name. My understanding from things that I've read from various sources was this was largely a move so that they wouldn't get sued by whoever owns the Highlander movie franchise intellectual property rights, which, okay. Not sure why Hasbro didn't just buy them, because they seem to buy the rights to a lot of things, but, so be it. I guess that's an opportunity for a new secret layer sometime coming, to your doorstep in 2024 or whatever. Now, as I mentioned, most of the modern rules made sense by the end of this era. Right? Commander damage was set to 21 combat damage. The color identity rule was set into place. So, for example, it used to be a card like Najeela, right? She's a red creature, but has 5 color pips in her ability. That used to be only playable as a red general. It could be playable in the 99 of a 5-color deck, and it couldn't be playable in the 99 of any other deck. But if it was your general, it was just a red general. So you had a mono red deck. And you couldn't generate mana of any color to activate her ability. So in the original rules of Commander, Najeela would be effectively useless, which is pretty neat. Although, let's be fair, you're still making warriors and swinging, and that's pretty good still. But the ability wouldn't have done anything, and it would have had to be mono red, which is a very different place for that card. And there are a lot of modern Legend designs that are very different. And we can track those designs' kind of proliferation all the way back to this change. Now, this era doesn't see that same proliferation. In fact, from 2007 to 2012, the new legendaries per set, new legendary creatures per set, again, ignoring reprint sets or sets you couldn't buy in boosters, so even ignoring the Commander precons here, was only about 5.4, or 5.04, sorry. Very few new legends per set, which means we weren't seeing the impact of design on the whole of what Wizards was doing yet. We will see that coming. So, Era 1 is very much EDH is localized. It's localized to judges, it's localized to Sheldon and the RC's play groups, and very slowly trickling out kind of by word of mouth more than anything else. This era, we start to see it grow, and it becomes a more global format. And it becomes more formalized as a format, which is kind of a big deal. It reached the threshold of needing more of a guiding hand than just, oh yeah, our group is doing this, so we think you all should do it too. Now we actually have recognition of the rules committee, not just on their website, but also by the end of this time, by Wizards as well. Remember, Wizards, when they made Commander, would have been a perfect time for them to take the RC and take control of Commander as a whole. Wizards chose not to do that. And part of the reason they chose not to do that, I think, and this is just speculation on my part, you're welcome to disagree, but I think part of the reason they chose to do that was because Commander doesn't make sense if you're Wizards. Like, it makes sense that people play it makes sense that people enjoy it, but it's a beast that's not manageable the way that Wizards wants to manage things, right? Wizards looks at other formats that they manage, like Standard or Modern or Legacy or whatever, and they can look at win rates for specific cards and specific decks, and they can look at it on Magic Online, and they can look at it on Arena, and they can look at it on in-paper events, and they can come and make decisions about things based on all that, like, hard numbers. And God, do people love hard numbers. It is one of perhaps the sins of society, how much people love hard numbers, and will take the quantitative over the qualitative in any day of the week. But EDH is a quantitative format, right? The true winners of the game, it's not necessarily the person who actually won. We don't really care all that often. It's how did people feel leaving the game. That's what makes Commander unique. That's what makes Commander actually click with people. And that's what makes Commander basically impossible for a corporation to be in charge of. Because a corporation doesn't have soul. Yes, the people inside the corporation do, but, like, there's already people inside WotC working on the rules committee. There's already people inside Wizards of the Coast working on the CAG, which I guess is more accurate. People volunteering for the CAG and volunteering for the RC work sometimes for Wizards of the Coast. They have actual jobs, and being the rules committee is just an extra thing they do. Or being the CAG is an extra thing they do. Anyways, looking at the bans that were bans that are no longer bans. Kaervek the Merciless, Rift Sweeper, Kakusho. These were all bans that became unbanned when rules changed. Kaervek was banned, and then the commander damage rule changed, got unbanned, right? Because if it's only combat damage you care about, Kaervek's not as powerful anymore. Rift Sweeper originally had format errata, because back in the day, your commander started in exile. When it changed to having this thing called the command zone, Rift Sweeper didn't need that errata anymore, and so it got unbanned. Now, the reason it was banned was because the errata went away first. So they said no more format errata. Rift Sweeper used to be able to not put your commander into a deck, so you used to shuffle non-commander exiled cards, and then they got rid of that errata, and it was banned, and then they made the command zone, and it was unbanned, because it wasn't busted anymore. Kakusho was banned as a commander, and when banned as commander went away, it was determined that Kakusho was fine, and could be released. A couple other cards here. Metalworker and Staff of Domination. These are cards that were banned because they created either too much of an advantage or were too easy to combo with, or just generally didn't jive with the way that EDH being played back in the day worked. Right? Staff of Domination kind of had that same problem with that Crucible of Worlds had, where it was very easy to outvalue other people with what tools were available at the time when you had Staff of Domination compared to other things. For example, another card during this time period, although it wasn't banned, it was looked at, specifically mentioned in a ban update, that the card Mind's Eye, was being watched. It's a 5-mana artifact that says when somebody else draws, you can pay 1 and draw a card. That, at this point in history of EDH, wasn't good enough to get banned, but had an eye on it to potentially be too good to get banned, or be too good and need to get banned. That shows you how different things were back then. Both of these cards have been subsequently unbanned. Staff of Domination hasn't really been a problem. Metalworker hasn't really been a problem, and now it's super expensive because it's on the reserve list, and so it's even less of a problem. Similarly, Grindstone and Painter's Servant. Grindstone was initially banned when Painter's Servant was released. Then Iona got released, and Painter's Servant got banned, and Grindstone got unbanned. Painter's Servant has quite the history. It was unbanned fairly recently, right? Most of these cards were unbanned a while back. Painter's Servant was only unbanned in 2019. But in the 2 years it's been free, it hasn't really done a whole lot. You also had Protean Hulk, which was banned and then unbanned, and Worldfire. These two were a little more interesting in how they got unbanned. So Protean Hulk gets unbanned in Era 3. Protean Hulk gets unbanned because basically the idea of the value it generates is fair enough, and people would be able to self-police themselves enough that it wouldn't just dominate games, right? Because it was originally banned around the same time that the Flash Hulk combo was getting utilized in Eternal formats like Vintage and Legacy, and then banned from those formats as Flash was restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy, because they banned the enabler in those formats. In this format, Flash and Hulk weren't necessarily utilized together enough. So Protean Hulk gets unbanned, and when we get to Era 3, that ends up being more of a problem than originally seen. Not for everyone, but for a particular group of players. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Worldfire, of course, was just unbanned. It is October of 2021 right now, and it was unbanned just a few weeks ago. And in the unban announcement, they mentioned that they want to have Commander be a place where expensive sorceries can get played. Now, this is my own personal opinion, but I can't fathom why Worldfire gets that treatment. Worldfire kind of sucks as a card. Like, again, this is my personal opinion, but like, the fail state for Worldfire is that nobody has permanents, hands, or graveyards, and everyone's at 1 life. Woof. That's like the worst case scenario, right? Normally it's just going to end the game out of nowhere. You'll have something like, I don't know, Keldon Marauders and 2 clones of Keldon Marauders or whatever. Or you'll float 12 mana and play Worldfire and then play Jessica and then minus Jessica to deal 1 to everybody else. Like, I don't love it. You can probably tell that by my voice, but like, I think that the Worldfire unban doesn't make sense looking at the philosophy. I don't think it does. Which prompted me to create this video. Does the Worldfire unban make sense when we look at historical aspects? And when I look at the other cards here that were banned and were unbanned, none of them were really big problems. Like, again, Protean Hulk was for players playing at high power levels. But Protean Hulk wasn't by itself the problem. But Painter's Servant, Grindstone, Kakusho, Metalworker, Staff of Domination, Rift Sweeper, Karavek the Merciless, like, really? Those cards were fine. So when we look at cards that were banned in this era, from Era 2, that have subsequently been unbanned, it's a pretty clean track record. I mean, again, Protean Hulk's a little tricky. But, like, even if we say that Protean Hulk was a problem, that's still 1 out of 8. That's not bad. So Worldfire being unbanned, I think it doesn't make sense philosophically. But if you look at the history, we start to see how maybe the RC could make that decision. Now, if we look at the cards that are banned from that era that are still banned, we have a boatload. 3 of them were originally banned as commanders and then banned outright. Braids, Arayo, and Raphaelos. Braids because she's the stacks queen. Arayo because also stacks and shuts people out of games just way too easily. And Raphaelos because the dude just ramps and ramps and ramps and ramps. All of those are things that are laid out in the philosophy of why they could be problems under different points. Coalition Victory, also banned. Now, I'll be honest, seeing Coalition Victory still on the list while Worldfire isn't seems a little backwards to me. I think Coalition Victory is by far the less offensive of the two cards. But again, looking at the history, we can see that Worldfire was banned incredibly quickly, to the point where it didn't really have much of a chance to be played at all. It was banned, I think, about 3 months after it was released, maybe even slightly faster than that. Certainly not more than 6 months. Whereas Coalition Victory had existed in the format for a while. I mean, it's a card from Invasion. Invasion came out in, 2000-ish? So it had a day in the sun, and it was deemed to be enough of a problem. So again, the philosophy doesn't necessarily explain the disparity between those two cards being banned or unbanned, but it does help make sense, if we look at the history, why Coalition Victory still is banned. Gifts Ungiven. Also a card where the philosophy doesn't necessarily pin down any one thing that Gifts Ungiven does that's egregious. You could make the argument that it maybe makes games play out the same way a little bit too much. But in terms of lots of the things that are ban list criteria that we see, Gifts Ungiven doesn't necessarily hammer home all of them, and certainly doesn't necessarily do so in a way that it's hitting home runs. I mean, Gifts Ungiven, if it's hitting points on those ban list ideas, it's hitting little bloopers out and getting singles off of it. That being said, again, if we look at the history, it makes sense why Gifts Ungiven was banned. Because Gifts Ungiven at the time it was banned was basically one of the best things you could be doing for targeted card advantage. Yeah, there were some big blue draw spells, but like Blue Sun Zenith didn't exist. You had Stroke of Knowledge, yes. You had Brain Geyser, yes. You had Intuition, which is pretty similar to Gifts Ungiven. But Gifts Ungiven, is a double demonic tutor, basically. If you're talking about a format where everybody wants to recur all their cards over and over again because you only get to use them once, Gifts Ungiven says, get me 2 pieces of recursion and 2 cards you want, and at instant speed, double demonic tutor. Really good. That's just a very good rate. And when you looked at what else was in existence at the time that it was banned, Gifts Ungiven was really one of the best cards out there. Scheherazade, probably the more is said about this, or the less is said about this, the better. It's just absurd, right? It's a super cool card design, but also a super terrible card design. It just doesn't work well with anything. Then we have some cards that are banned, that were banned for kind of not the same, but all, in a way, power level reasons. Emrakul was banned because it's just a soup of things that are too good. It's an extra turn spell. It is one of the biggest beaters in the game. It is stacks because it destroys all these people's stuff. It's just brutal. Sundering Titan is very similar. It's not all those things, but it's a stacks piece on legs, which blows up a ton of lands. It sets people back to the Stone Age. It's also worth noting that Sundering Titan was legal for a long time, at the same time as the spell Tinker, which, gross. Primeval Titan was a card that just had games revolve around it. Now, nowadays, you might look at that and say, well, how did games revolve around Primeval Titan? Yeah, there's some combos you can do with lands, and you can definitely get an advantage ramping out lands, but how did games revolve around it? And the answer to that is that back then, again, historically, clones were way more common. And part of that's due to the fact that clones were also removal back then. The legend rule was different, so that if you had a legend and somebody else had the same legend as you, both of them got destroyed or sacrificed as a state-based action. So lots of clones were running around anyways, and suddenly Primeval Titan became really good to clone, became really good to reanimate. It's always been good to clone and good to reanimate, but EDH became really centered on doing those things. Similarly, Recurring Nightmare is a card that was banned because of that same kind of value proposition that Primeval Titan presents. It's just too much value in too efficient a package, right? Primeval Titan is getting you at least 2 lands, maybe 4, maybe 6, maybe 8. And if you clone it or bounce it or blink it, it's getting you even more. Recurring Nightmare is getting you your 187 effects, your enter the battlefield effects, again and again and again, for a fairly low cost. all you need is at least one creature in the yard and one creature in play, and you can start doing stuff with Recurring Nightmare. And Recurring Nightmare is just unintuitive to interact with. Two other cards that were banned just for raw power level were Tinker and Tolarian Academy. Also Time Vault. Time Vault got errata that made it the busted card it is today, because it removed some other errata, so it worked differently than it did, and then they removed that, and then it worked better than it did, which is what happened with Flash as well. And then Tinker and Tolarian Academy. Tinker, of course, lets you cheat an artifact into play for an absurdly low cost. Back then, the best artifacts to get were the aforementioned Sundering Titan or Darksteel Colossus, or even like Darksteel Forge was pretty good. You get all those things and then just like go absurd with the rest of your deck. Tolarian Academy worked in kind of the same kind of decks, where you want a bunch of cheap artifacts, of which there are many because mana rocks are very plentiful, and you would play out a bunch of your mana rocks. You would get a ton of mana off of them, you would get a ton of mana off of Academy, and then you could refill your hand with something like, Gifts Ungiven, right? Which turns out pretty good. Now, these are cards that were banned for various things that we can actually look at the philosophy and say, they kind of hit points on this here and there. We can kind of fiddle them in and make them fit like kind of like puzzle pieces. The next set of cards were banned for philosophical reasons that are very clearly obvious. Fastbond, Channel, Gristlebrand, they're all banned because they don't work with the rules of the format very well, right? All of them allow you to pay life to do something. When you start with 40 life, turns out that it's very good to be doing that. Channel lets you pay life for mana. Fastbond lets you pay life for lands, so basically mana. And Gristlebrand lets you pay life to draw cards. Gristlebrand also has the added benefit of being a creature, so it's easy to cheat and play, and being its own engine because it has lifelink too. Gross. You also have limited resources and Caracas. Limited resources doesn't play nicely with it being multiplayer because it sets the total number of lands at the table to 10. It can be slightly more than 10, so if you have, say, 4 players each have 4 lands, when limited resource comes into play, everybody, all right, total number at the table is going to be 16. Okay, cool. But if a limited resources comes down early, it hard locks how many lands people can have. If it comes down late, it sets everybody back to 5, or potentially fewer. Caracas, when it was errated that you could not, or when it was removed from having format-specific errata, so originally they added the text, you can't bounce a commander to it. When they decided that it was better for the format to remove those format-specific errata, which I agree with, that was 100% a thing that made sense. Caracas had to be banned, because otherwise you just bounce somebody's commander over and over and over again. Maybe even your own. Now, the reason I agree with removing format errata, again, goes back to the history. It has nothing to do with the philosophy of the format. The philosophy of the format could fit commander errata in it very easily. The reason it made sense is the reason that we're even talking about this, because commander has changed. It changed by its growth during this time period. And as it grew, the idea of the cognitive load, the barrier to entry of format-specific errata was just considered too high. And there were like 4 cards that had it, right? It was like Caracas couldn't bounce commanders, Rift Sweeper couldn't shuffle commanders into your deck, 9.5 Tails, no, not 9.5 Tails, Runetail Kitsune Ascendant flipped at like 50 life instead of 30 life or something like that. I feel like there was one more, but maybe it was literally just those 3. Like, it wasn't very many. So, it made sense to get rid of that. Not philosophically, necessarily, but it made sense in terms of the history. So again, we want to look through both lenses, because not every decision makes sense through just one. Now, could Caracas be banned with no, like, if you didn't have errata, would it need to be banned? Yes, absolutely, right? So philosophically, it makes sense. All of these cards here also make sense philosophically to be banned. The issue of errata is what could or could not be supported by philosophy. Which brings us to the third era. And I call this the expansion era, because this is when WotC went full in on Commander. This is when Commander goes from being a format to being the format. Now, this happens to overlap with a few different things. At the end of this era, there were a couple historically bad standards. Right? Kaladesh standard was just not good. Battle for Zendikar standard was also not great. So we have these pretty bad standards at the end of this era. You have Wizards pumping out a Commander deck every year, right? So there was one in 2011, then they took a break in 2012, but from 2013 forward, there were Commander decks every year, even to this point. We still have a Commander deck set every year. In fact, now we have more than one every year, because we have them usually about two decks per set that comes out, as well as a yearly set of 4. And in fact, this year I think we even had an extra set of 4 with the... or maybe those were the original ones. I don't know. Anyways, we have a bunch of Commander decks now. That's the point. Also, this is when the last pieces of the rules really fall into place. Like, there are a couple things that have changed since then, but they're relatively small. Whereas this has the last few big pieces. The creation of off-color mana being allowed for decks to do, that was a big one. It might seem small, but philosophically, that's pretty big, because it moves away from being a restriction to being more lenient, more able to be... I'm blanking on the word I want here. But it makes it so that you are able to do what you want instead of having to work around restrictions. And the reason they did that was because the rule they had that restricted making off-color mana said that mana that you would have made. So let's say you're playing a blue deck. If you made red mana somehow, let's say you like steal artifact somebody's Braid of Fire or something. All that mana that would have been red would instead become colorless. That's how this used to work. They changed it. And why did they change it? Well, philosophically, there's nothing there to say, well, why would this not work? But if we look historically, there was a set called Oath of the Gatewatch that came out that had cards with colorless mana in their mana costs for the first time ever. Not just generic mana that could be paid with whatever color, but specifically had to be paid with colorless. That's what did it. And so they changed it to make those cards make thematic sense. And again, it was kind of the same reason they got rid of those format-specific errata. It lowered the cognitive load, which makes it easier for people to play. They also removed the tuck rule, which made it slightly more focused on commanders. The tuck rule used to be that an effect like, for example, Spin into Myth was one of the common cards. And if you aren't familiar with that card, don't worry about it. It's pretty weird. But what it did was it allowed you to put a creature either on the bottom or the top of its owner's library. So you could put somebody's commander on the bottom of the library. And that was a way to permanently get rid of commanders for the most part. In this point, they getting rid of commanders permanently. Yes, there are a few corner cases where you can still do it, but they're hard to do and generally not things that people actually care to do. So yeah, it's out there, but like, why? Whereas back then, tuck cards were common. I mean, if we look at the first set of commander precons, one of them includes the spell Oblation, which is a tuck card. There's a card printed specifically in that commander set called Spell Crumple, which is a counter spell that puts Spell Crumple, the card itself, and the card it's countering, into their owner's libraries. That's a tuck card. So that all kind of creates this issue where this tuck rule was a way to just kneecap kind of the centerpiece of the format, right? Commanders are the centerpiece of the format. People are building around them. And so removing the tuck rule makes it even more clear what the format is about. It's not about necessarily that grind fest anymore. It has shifted focus from being about, the idea that you're leading a whole army, and so the whole thing has to be put into place here with your elder dragon at the front of it. But now it's about your commander. And with this, we also get the concept of, commanderness. That your commander is your commander no matter where it is. That was also new. And that was a way for them to work with the tuck rule so that, if something was put into your hand, you would know that it's your commander, so you could put it in your command zone. I'm sure there's some reasons for that I'm not smart enough to wrap my head around, but they did it. Another big piece, which again reduced the cognitive load, was matching mulligan rules to the rest of Magic. There are kind of two reasons they did this. One is to reduce that cognitive load, right? Having a different mulligan in EDH actually would make sense philosophically if we looked at it, right? Because the philosophy of EDH in many ways is people should be able to do the thing. They should be able to do the thing their deck wants to do. Mulligans and Mana Screw can prevent that from happening. So if we want games to be interactive and we want people to have a chance to do their thing and show off their deck, well, it would make sense that we have a different mulligan. And in fact, I think the RC has said themselves that they follow a different mulligan rule than even the one that's officially in the RC's rules. They, I believe, follow a rule that's basically the effect of draw 7 until you have a capable hand and don't abuse it, which can work with a private group if you've got one that works really well, but doesn't work for a global rule. And it also kind of still highlights the way in which EDH and Commander are different. Even though it's the same format, the way that EDH started, that small, intimate affair, versus what it is now, the biggest format in Magic, those have to be handled in different ways. They do. And the RC has, I think, navigated that fairly well, but they have not always explained their navigation well, which is where this kind of history comes into place. Now, as I mentioned, we can see WotC really starting to take off with design for Commander during this time period. Not just specifically design for Commander, like the Commander precons, but also designs that mesh well with Commander. And the best way to track that is the number of new legendaries, which at this point rose to 8.7 average per new booster set. 8.7. That's a lot. It's not as much as we're going to see. And it's also skewed towards the back end of this year range. There are more legendary creatures in the later sets during this era than at the beginning. So the beginning sets might have 5 or 6. The later sets might have 10 or 11. That's how we get to this 8.7 average. Now, during this era, the previous eras, we saw a lot of banned cards. We saw a lot of cards that were banned and then unbanned. We saw a lot of cards that were banned and still banned. This era only produced 4 cards that are banned. None of them have been unbanned. Only 4 were banned during this time period. One of them was Trade Secrets. Trade Secrets was just not a card that works with multiplayer. It's not good in 1v1, but it's at least kind of interesting there. Whereas in multiplayer, effectively what it does is it takes 2 players and makes the game entirely about them. Now, yes, there are people who will make whole game theory arguments about, what's the right number to draw off Trade Secrets? Is it X? Is it Y? Is it Z? None of that cares, right? Your average person sitting down to play EDH doesn't give a rip about game theory, right? They just don't care. They don't. I don't care. I'm getting bored just talking about it. Trade Secrets says to the player that's being targeted and the player who cast it, you guys are probably both just going to draw your whole deck. Have fun. And that doesn't work well for the other players at the table. Another card that was banned during this time period because it doesn't play well with multiplayer is Sylvan Primordial. It's so much value coming into play, blowing up non-land permanents, and ramping you for doing so. Pretty absurd. And it's not even a may. It's a must. So, if your opponent only has lands, basically you have to take out one of their lands. Just not optional. It's just mean. And oftentimes that's honestly probably the best thing you could do with it. And because it's green, that 7 mana value isn't as high as it might seem, because you have lots of ramp to get you there, and so you get kind of the same issue that you had with Primeval Titan, where it's just so much value that people want to copy it and blink it and clone it, and that's just not great. Prophet of Crufix did the same thing. It didn't necessarily blow up people's lands or get you lands, but it was so much value. It basically, in this way, it almost is like an extra turn card, except that it functions basically every turn. Now, can you do everything with Flash? No. It's not a full Vidalcan Orrery, and it's not a full Seedborn Muse, but it's basically like 3/4 of a Vidalcan Orrery and 3/4 of a Seedborn Muse stapled together for the same cost as a Seedborn Muse. Not exactly pushing any barriers in terms of making it difficult to cast, and not making any barriers in terms of it being difficult to utilize either. The card just was very good, and games revolved around it to the point where it was often just a question of, who's going to get their Prophet first, be able to protect it, and have enough creatures that draw cards attached to them that they can draw into what they need to do to win. This is in your average game of EDH. In high power EDH, things are going to be different because the end goal is slightly different. Now, Leovold is perhaps the first example of the way in which WotC approached EDH, changing the way in which EDH is dealt with. Leovold is really powerful. It's got 2 abilities that are pretty good just on their own on it, and one of them makes it so that your opponents just can't play the game when you have the right combination of cards. This one doesn't need history to understand why it got banned. It pretty straightforward makes sense why this card got whacked. It was just too strong. Now, the ban list announcement where Leovold got banned ended up being the same where Protean Hulk got unbanned. And so you have kind of an interesting thing that happens there in High Power Commander, which we'll get to in a minute. But first, let's talk about where we're at now. So in 2019, the Rules Committee finally openly admitted, I think they were well aware of this beforehand, but they openly admitted that Commander was a different beast now than it was when they started. And maybe they're not going to say it in those words, but I think the creation of the CAG pretty well proves it. That no longer was it able to be contained like it was when it was a smaller, more intimate affair. Now it's the biggest format. The biggest. And it's run by 4 dudes. And 4 dudes making decisions that affect that many people isn't always the easiest thing to do. One, it isn't the easiest thing to do in terms of just like the feedback from it, obviously, because people are awful. But also it isn't the easiest thing to do in terms of remaining steadfast to their philosophy while also addressing the needs of the people who are playing it. So they create the Commander Advisor Group. The Commander Advisor Group, it shrunk at one point and then grew at another point. But right now it's, I believe, 12 people who get information and provide feedback to the RC about what they're doing, about what people are doing, how people are enjoying the game. Spread across the globe, although very US-centric and especially North American-centric, but getting information from the people who are out playing. Not just themselves, and not just, the group of people that they're all ingratiated with, because if you look online, you'll see that a lot of the CAG and a lot of the RC and a lot of the people they interact with is the same relatively small group of people, right? In a certain sense, the RC has grown their inner circle some. They've expanded the ivory tower, but haven't necessarily opened the doors all the way. But in other senses, they have at least let people into the courtyard, and the CAG is part of that. The CAG is certainly inside the ivory tower, but the CAG also gives people access. They give people a glimpse at how things work a little bit. And I'll be honest, I think the smartest thing the RC did when they created the CAG is they created people who actually give some reasoning behind decisions being made. If you look at Banlist decisions, they do include reasoning, but they're never really particularly explicit about why, right? So even when Golos was banned, the most recent banning, talks a little bit about how he does a bunch of things, but there's no big, these are the specific reasons, this is what it means for the format, this is the message we want people to take from this, even if the message is, not for everyday people. There's a little bit of that. Don't get me wrong, there's some of it there. But it's not particularly deeply explicit. And Golos is perhaps the most explicit that there has ever been. That's the thing. Golos' explanation for why it's banned is more direct than most other bannings have been. And that has, in the past, that's why this whole video is something I felt like I wanted to do, is to kind of try to connect, all right, how did things happen so that these cards ended up needing to be put on the list? And I know I didn't go into a lot of depth on most of them, but at least having some sense of where things came from is a little helpful. The CAG at least gives some more insight into, all right, why did they make these decisions? Why did they make decisions not to ban something else? Why did they make decisions to ban something? And for the people on the CAG who are willing to engage with people more openly, it leads to a pretty interesting way of seeing where the thinking is on the people making decisions for EDH. We also, at this point, have the formalized version of the format philosophy created. That's that format philosophy that you can see on their website. It's the one that I pulled out the points from at the very beginning of this video. That wasn't written down in the same way until 2019. So when we look back at those cards that were banned, there were some reasons written in the rules. These are reasons why cards might be banned. But it wasn't given the full philosophical treatment like it has been now. We weren't given that open door of this is what they want. We were kind of given nudges and winks, but unless you were really plugged in, it was kind of hard to miss some of those nudges and winks. Whereas now, it's at least very visible. You don't have to be nudged anymore. You can either view it or not. That's your choice. Now, there have been a couple other changes. Commander death triggers now work. The wish rule that makes it so the wishes don't work got tweaked a little bit so that companions do work, which is a little bit odd, historically speaking, given that, once upon a time wishes were banned. So it's a little odd that even companions get a pass on that. I've got another video on that you're welcome to take a look at. Now, this is where we see the biggest change. 20.41 new legendary creatures on average per new booster set. Again, ignoring reprint sets, ignoring direct product like Secret Lairs or Commander Precons, anything like that. Just in boosters. 20.41. That is so many. Each new set has more legendary creatures in it on average, more than twice as many as any previous era. Now, to be fair, that does include Commander Legends. So if we take Commander Legends out, it's still 17.25. Again, still more than double any previous era in terms of average number of creatures that can be commanders per set. This isn't an RC thing, right? This is a contextualization of why on earth is the RC approaching things the way they are. And part of it is because Wizards, while not taking control of the format, has in a way exerted a ton of influence on the format. And we see that with the huge number of new commanders being printed. We see that with the huge number of new cards that are specifically made to be played in Commander, and really Commander only. And some of those things lead to problems. Now, this era has featured bans that have been fairly controversial. Paradox Engine was controversial because it lasted for a year and a half before getting banned and was fairly pricey. Keep in mind, many of the cards that have been banned throughout the history of EDH were not that expensive when they were banned. If we ignore the 8 cards of the Power 9 and Library of Alexandria, most of the others have been between $1 and $20 when they've been banned. Paradox Engine was well over that. And part of that is just the history of the economics of the game, which are bat stuff crazy. Loopy. And I know that those words are kind of ableist to use here, but the economics of Magic are truly bizarre. And so Paradox Engine was worth a lot. And the controversy wasn't necessarily that the card shouldn't have gotten banned. It was that the card financially walloped some people getting banned, which never feels good. At the same time, you had Iona, which had dodged a ban for years and years, finally getting banned. A card that people had been talking about since she had been printed, about this should be banned. I remember the preview for her going on the MTG Commander forums and reading post after post in a thread, Iona is just disastrous. Now, unfortunately, those, have been lost to the ether because the internet, sadly, as much as everything on the internet is forever, it's not always forever, which is unuseful when you want to find something specific. But Iona was identified by players as, this is going to be a problem. And the RC, for a long time, didn't ban it. And then the CAG comes along and they convince the RC, and I don't know that they convinced the RC, but they certainly, I think, had an influence on the RC with this one, that Iona probably should be banned. And so Iona got banned. And Painter's Servant got unbanned at the same time. Because with Iona banned, there's not a ton of reason for Painter's Servant to still be on the list. Now, they have made official statements that claim the two are unrelated. I think it's fair to be skeptical of those statements. I think it's fair to say that given the history of Painter's Servant, which, again, not a lot of people are necessarily aware of, but given that it was unbanned before Iona, but Grindstone was banned, and then Iona was printed, and Painter's Servant was banned, and Grindstone was unbanned, I think it's fair to take a look at it and say, maybe there's a little bit more at play with Painter's Servant than just 2 individual cards being looked at individually. Which is why I think it's important to have this, to try and look at things through the historical lens as well. So, Iona got banned after years and years and years of not being unbanned. Paradox Engine got banned after a couple years of being printed and being allowed to run free. But both of these aren't particularly bans that are questionable in terms of the content of the card. Iona makes a lot of sense why it needed to be banned. She's clearly antithetical to the philosophy of the format, right? Her whole thing is that she stops people from playing, which is one of the clear and obvious signs of, this card might be a problem. Whereas Paradox Engine, it's not quite as clear why it's a problem, but with the proliferation of mana rocks that exist and cheap cantrips and things like that, you could take Paradox Engine and have a turn that would be 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes long where you don't do much other than cast a few spells, make a bunch of mana, and then maybe play your commander. Cool. But you have to do all these untaps, and you have to do all these taps again, and it makes it rough. But Paradox Engine got a whole lot of complaints from people who the next banning impacted in a more positive way. And that was the high power crowd, or the CEDH crowd. And I know that, if I say CEDH and high power are the same thing, people are going to wig out, but to be honest, I think they're much closer in what they do and in terms of their impact and percentage of the community. Like, if we lump high power and CEDH together, it's still a minority of players, and I think that the line between the two is hard to suss out. Anyways, CEDH was dogged by Flash and Protean Hulk from the time that Protean Hulk was unbanned. Protean Hulk with Flash is an instant, lets you put the Protean Hulk into play, and then immediately sacrifice it with no opportunity for anybody to do kind of anything in between that happening. So if you resolve Flash with a Protean Hulk in hand, you're probably just going to win, because there are all sorts of different things you can go find to win. It became even more egregious after Thassa's Oracle was printed, but even before Thassa's Oracle, it was pretty rough. It was kind of a dominating strategy, and part of the reason that it was so bad was because of the play styles that it engendered. Basically, you couldn't tap out to do anything because you had to leave your interaction up, because anybody could win. Anybody who was playing blue and green could win at any time if they had 2 mana open, which not the most fun experience. And so when Flash got banned, it was very specifically stated as the RC was doing this so that the people playing at those higher ends would be more able to keep playing the way they wanted to play. And they also said that it was a one-time deal and it wasn't going to happen again, which for some reason caused some consternation among people. But given that they flat out say that the ban list is not designed to regulate competitive play, and even though CEDH, it calls itself competitive EDH, it's not competitive, it's still casual in nature. But even despite that, the Flash ban was kind of a big divergence from what the RC normally does. So, kind of a interesting ban there, and that's why it was controversial. It was a step away from their normal path of doing things. Also controversial was Lutri. Lutri actually being banned, I don't think was that controversial. Lutri being banned makes a lot of sense. What was controversial about Lutri is the expansion of the wish rule to allow companions to work. So companion allows you to play nowadays it allows you to put a card from outside the game into your hand as part of the ability. The issue, of course, is that to make companion work, the rule regarding wishes had to change. It used to say bringing cards in from outside of the game can't happen. That's not exactly what it said, but that's paraphrasing it. Now it specifically says cards that bring other cards from outside the game don't function in Commander. So Companion is given a walk because they're self-referential. They bring themselves in, which is a little bit odd. So if we look at philosophically, there's nothing that really supports that. In fact, philosophically, I think there's more of an argument that Companion shouldn't work. Now again, that's my personal opinion here. But philosophically, if you want to avoid games that play the same, having access to a card that is the payoff for something you're doing in your deck at any time isn't necessarily going to help you avoid repetitive play. It's not necessarily going to lead to games where people feel like they can do their thing the same, right? If we look at some of the companions, some of them can kind of push the line a little bit in a casual format like this. And Lutri had to be banned because its restriction was literally just one of the rules of Commander, that you can't have non-land cards with the same name. But if you're playing a Commander, you've already got that. So Lutri had to be banned because of that. But if we look at the historical lens, we can see why they put this into place. Historically, Commander had always been more restrictive than it is now. Always. As time has gone on, restrictions about what can be a Commander or how Commander works have been lifted, right? So it used to be, a card like Memnarch or Bosch couldn't be a general. Now it can, because they got the color identity rule. They added that. It used to be, supposedly, I guess I don't know this for sure, but way back in the day, in theory, you actually had to play Elder Dragon. And then there was the league, what they called the league play rule, where you had to kind of register your commander so that there was never two of the same commander in one spot or one game at the same time. And all of that kind of leads to more restrictions in the eyes of the RC historically. More restrictions are what they're used to. They're used to having restrictions be in place. And so if you get a payoff for those restrictions, then why not give it a shot? And so philosophically, like I said, I don't think companion should work philosophically. But in terms of the other lens, this history, companion makes sense because it's providing new ways to explore restrictions in the game, which is the answer you'll get, right? The philosophy document doesn't say anything about necessarily restrictions. It says that the rules of the format enforce the flavor of the format, and it says that games are supposed to be, have variance in them, and embrace that variance. Having a card in a certain zone all the time with access to it isn't necessarily embracing variance very much, is it? But yet, when we look at this historical lens, the answer you get that, the restrictions are fun and they make it more interesting for people, that lines up very well with the way that EDH started. So that kind of helps explain that decision. Then we have Hull Breacher. Hull Breacher was banned in the summer of 2021. Hull Breacher is very similar to Leovold. If you had never seen Leovold and you had seen Hull Breacher, if you knew that one was legal, you would probably assume the other was legal, and if you knew that one was banned, you would probably assume that the other was banned. They do very similar things. Hull Breacher obviously can't be played as a commander, but it also can be played in the 99 in far, far more decks. And turns out it's just as much of a problem as Leovold. Even if it's not there to build around, you're able to draw into it, you're able to play it, you're able to play it with effects like Wheel of Fortune or Windfall, and that ends up being unpleasant for the people you're playing with. Which brings us to Golos. Right, and Golos is kind of the reason I wanted to make this video. Golos and Worldfire, right? Because I didn't think the Worldfire unbanning made a lot of sense philosophically, and I still don't think it does. But in looking at this, it makes slightly more sense historically. Golos is kind of the same way. Does it make a ton of sense to ban Golos from the philosophy? You could say yes, I suppose. It does some things, right? It kind of circumvents the commander tax, and it can lead to some repetitive games. But the reason it gets quoted the most is that, well, it kind of replaces other commanders, right? It makes it less likely that you're going to play some other commander and you're just going to play Golos in its place. And that sort of fits with the philosophy, but it also fits much better with the historic view of the format. Again, remember, thinking that it used to be that you couldn't even, or the official rules made it so that you wouldn't be able to have two of the same commander in the same table. That leads to a situation where if you have a bunch of people playing Golos and you run into multiple Golos pods, that's a situation that the RC, that's well outside of the ivory tower. That's well outside the sandbox they've created. In fact, I would imagine that any pod that has multiple of the same commander in it is probably an oddity in the RC's eyes. It's probably an oddity in what they want the format to be. Yet it happens. And so if you have a commander that's pushing out others because of just its attractiveness and all the things it does, then it leads to a problem that historically they could have solved within a group. But of course, historically, that group isn't the same anymore, right? It used to be a local play group. Now it's a global play group. And the play group is millions of people big. Not everybody always agrees and gets along, but it's millions of people. And so relying on the same tools that you could rely on back when the play group was a dozen people or even 10 dozen people, those don't work anymore. And the RC knows that. It's why they've made changes and adapted and included things like the CAG. It's why they've made adjustments to the rules and why they continue to have quarterly meetings. But they haven't done a good job selling that either. Because in many cases, the same complaints people have about the RC today are the same complaints they had 10 years ago. We're talking about nearly 20 years of history of this format, and for the last 10 years, people are making the same complaints. I think it's time for the RC to embrace their history a little bit more, and a little bit more explicitly, and tell us how they're coming to these decisions instead of just pinning it on the philosophy. Yes, the philosophy is important, obviously. But give us the history too. Explain why cards were banned. Give us a full breakdown. And this is something people have been hoping for years. And so maybe this is going to fall on deaf ears. Maybe not. But I'd like to see it. I'd like to see an explanation of what was banned, when it was banned, why it was banned. Not just through reading an archive of the posts that people have collected from the RC over time, but from the RC themselves. That's what I want to see. Do I think I'll see it? No, not really. I don't think I will. I think they'll continue to lean on the philosophy and say this is why things are banned. And I think they'll continue to neglect making the history more public, which is disappointing because as we come up on almost 20 years of this format actually being crafted and created and catered, as more and more of those resources that were the history of this format disappear, there's less and less opportunity to really gather up what we know about it. Because if the RC relies on their institutional knowledge, relies on their experiences, and relies on their past, at some point that runs out. When members of the RC retire from doing the RC, which they've all said at some point they want to, and I think Sheldon has even said that sometime in the next 5 years, and I think he said this last year, so that would make it like 4 years from now, if the RC doesn't look different than it did, then they're not doing their job, which leads me to think we're going to see some changes at some point. But the question is, what are those changes going to look like? And are they going to have a different view on some of these decisions that seem guided less explicitly by the philosophy and more by the history and experiences? We should trust that expertise, but we should also ask that it be made visible. Anyways, this has been long. If you've stuck in for this whole time, I appreciate you. Please show me some love by hitting that subscribe button, by ringing that bell to get notifications when I go and make some other videos. Who knows if we'll have more of these, but I'd like to keep trying it. This is an experiment. Hopefully you liked it. If you did like it, or if you didn't like it, leave me some feedback in the comments. And until next time, I'm Squirrelmob, and this has been my perspective. Bye, everybody.